All right, we're going to start by discussing gear today. And like I mentioned in the last lecture, when we're talking about gear, we're going to talk about things kind of coupled. So, certain things that flow together rather than one big long 20-minute, half hour, 40-minute lecture. So we're going to start off with shelter and kind of our overall sleep system. So with shelter, some of the things that you want to consider, and what I mean by shelter is your tent, right, or other things, which we'll get into shortly. But we want to think about the length of your shelter as well as the height of your shelter. So if you're who is small or tall or likes to sit up or lay down, um, the overall weight of your shelter and the how easy it is to set up. Can you set up in the rain? Can you set up by yourself, or do you need another person? Do you require having trees? Things like that. The number of doors are important to people, so access to inside the shelter. Um, and is there any sort of vestibule or storage? So depending on the season. So let's go into the detail of some of these things here. So thinking specifically about shelters, there's lots of options that you have. The three on the screen are going to be the most common options that you see. There are other options. One is called a bivy. If you're interested in that, you can look that up. But it's not something that we see commonly anymore now that tents have gotten so light and some of these other options. But a bivy is essentially a sleeping bag with a face cover over it. So something to look into. But as far as what you will commonly see on the trail, so the tent, which most of us are going to be able to know on the upper right part of the screen there. So this is really the most common option that we see, and this is where some of those topics that we were discussing on the last side come into play. So they make tents a certain generic size, and then sometimes you can get them in long. So like I said, if you're someone who is 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", you'll definitely want to consider looking into options and brands that have a long option that give you a couple more feet. Some people prefer buying the long version of the tent because they can put all their pack and a lot of their gear in there as well. A lot of times when people do snow camping and they bring in, like I said, all that gear to keep it from freezing overnight, they'll get they'll splurge for the longer version. The problem with the longer versions is it weighs more, typically costs more. So something to consider. So what things do people consider when they are picking their sleeping system, their shelter? So the weight, the overall cost, and the ease of setup. So tents are going to be heavier than hammocks. Hammocks are going to be heavier than the tarp system that you see in the bottom right corner. That tarp system is for lightweight backpacking. You'll see people who are doing really long through hikes, like the PCT, the Pacific Crest Trail, that are going to be on the trail for 6+ months. You'll see a lot of this. Some of the downsides to these tarps are going to be the fact that you're exposed. So you're not going to get as warm as a tent's going to give you. You're obviously exposed to things like bugs, and in the Sierra we have lots of mosquitoes, so you're not really protected from that. And obviously just any other sort of critter, but like I said, you will see these. The next lightest weight option is typically going to be your hammock, and that's because you can use different weight straps, buy different weight hammocks, things like that. Downside to this is you have to find the perfect trees. They have to be healthy trees, and it is a lot colder than a tent. A tent is going to be significantly warmer than these other two options. But there's a lot of people who are opting out of tent camping and moving to hammocks. Another downside to the hammock is like I said, the challenge of having more than one person hammocking at the same campsite, because there's not usually a bunch of trees to work with, although you may have seen those cool pictures on Instagram of people putting like 8 hammocks stacked on top of each other. As far as the tent, that's going to be our most go-to system. Some of the things to consider if you're looking to pick a tent is the overall cost it takes, What is the size that it packs down to so you can fit it in your backpack? Is it a 2-person, 1-person, 3-person backpacking tent? How many doors are there? Ultralight, super, super light tents usually only have one door at the feet, and you crawl in and out that way because zippers weigh more than the fabric of the tent. How easy is this tent to set up? Can you do this by yourself? Is it what we call freestanding? The tent that you'll see on the screen is freestanding, meaning that regardless of what you're doing, it can stay. But non-freestanding tents mean that maybe they freestand once you have all the poles in place, but they don't do that before, or it requires using a trekking pole or staking your tent. So all important things. If you want to know more details about any of this gear, just set up a time to meet with me, and I'm happy to nerd out and answer any of the questions that you have. Sleep system. So what goes inside your shelter? So we're going to talk about sleeping bags, sleeping pads, and accessories associated with those. So first and foremost, we have sleeping bags. Biggest thing is there's a difference between a backpacking sleeping bag and a car camping sleeping bag. So in the top right corner, you'll see the backpacking sleeping bag, and that is what we call a mummy shape, okay? And so with that mummy shape, what we've done is we have eliminated some of that excess fabric that goes into making the square shaped one that you'll see in the bottom center of this screen. And so it makes it lighter and usually makes it pack down smaller. Why do we do this? Because it's easier to carry, less material. It's usually warmer than a square because you have, or a rectangle sleeping bag because you have less air to heat inside the sleeping bag. And so, like I said, backpacking, you'll usually see that mummy size, and they'll have some sort of a hood. The temperature ratings of a bag, if a bag is rated at 20 degrees, it's a 20-degree bag. That means that that's the lowest temperature that you want to be at in that tent. In that sleeping bag. So if the Sierra is going to drop to 32 degrees, which is freezing, you probably want a 22-degree bag. So you want that 10-degree range. This can be a little bit confusing, but the bag is rated at, I can keep you alive at this temperature. Okay, so you always want to bump up from there. There's a difference between men and women's bag. First of all, let's start with the temperature rating. The temperature rating of a woman's bag is typically 10 degrees higher than a men's because women sleep 10 degrees colder than men. So if a man's bag is rated at 30 degrees, it would be rated at 20 degrees for a woman. Okay? There's obviously exceptions to this rule. This is generalizing. There are some women that sleep at the same temperature as men. But like I said, this is just generalizing so that way people aren't uncomfortable in the backcountry. So that's something to be considerate of if you're borrowing a sleeping bag from someone, if you're a woman and borrowing from a man or vice versa. Okay? The other thing is the shape of the bag is slightly different for men and women. And it's interesting because in a lot of the outdoor world, most of our gear it can be marketed for women, and it's the exact same gear. And what we call it in the outdoor industry is shrink it and pink it. And so these companies are trying to make more money by taking the exact same product and supposedly marketing it, and I'm putting that in air quotes, to women. Okay? But sleeping bags happen to be the exception to the rule. So like I said, it's that temperature rating, but it's also where the majority of the stuffing of the sleeping bag is located. So for women, for women's bags, there's actually more stuffing that keeps the sleeping bag warm in the feet area of the sleeping bag. Women typically complain of sleeping colder as well as having cold feet while they sleep. And so this is a little perk to women's bags. And like I said, if you're a woman that's not the case for you, then I wouldn't worry so much about this. Then the size of the bag. The difference between the shape and size of the bag for men's and women's is men's bags are typically longer than women's bags. And men's bags are typically wider in the shoulder section of the bag versus women's bags are typically wider in the hips. So again, we're generalizing for the sake of keeping people comfortable in the backcountry. As far as materials used, the biggest question that you're going to ask yourself when purchasing a sleeping bag is, do I want down or synthetic? So let's go over the pros and cons to each. Okay, down sleeping bags, which is goose feathers, is typically going to pack considerably smaller than a synthetic bag. It is also going to be slightly warmer than a synthetic bag for the size of it. So it doesn't mean you can't get a synthetic bag that's the same size. I mean the same temperature. Okay. Downsides to down sleeping bags is that when they get wet, you have to fully they have to fully dry before they will keep you warm versus a synthetic bag will keep you warm. Also, from a moral standpoint, there are people who are very anti-down. They're coming from goose feathers. It's that warm feather that's underneath. Now, there is ethically sourced down goose feathers, but that's typically very expensive because they're essentially waiting for the feathers to fall off the geese and then collecting them. And so they have these farms for collecting these goose feathers. So there's things to consider there. Alternative, synthetic. Synthetic is very small micro slivers of plastic. So again, it doesn't pack down as well. It doesn't shrink into what we call a stuff sack to fit into your pack as easily. But if it gets wet, it will actually, although not comfortably, but it will keep you warmer and still have value to you over a down bag. If a synthetic bag is typically cheaper and not as expensive as a down sleeping bag, and there are mixes of the two. From an ethically sourced standpoint, more people are comfortable with a synthetic bag. And then as far as both, you can get your sleeping bags treated with a water treatment or not treated. And all of those things change the cost associated. Sleeping pads. Sleeping pads is what is the barrier between you and Mother Nature, Mother Earth, if you will. And these are non-negotiable in the backcountry, okay? And it's not the same as a yoga mat. So by having a sleeping pad, it helps keep your warmth in. The ground is significantly larger than you, and it will just suck your heat, even on a warmer night. It will suck your heat all night long and keep you from comfort. Now, these also give you some sort of padding and comfort, but they don't, and then they help you keep in your warmth. This is something that you always want to have, even if you are in a tarp or even in a hammock. You still want to have that sleeping pad underneath. Okay, sleeping pads have a temperature rating as well, and it's in the form of something called an R value. Okay, the R value is going to be a rating between 1 and 10, 10 being the warmest a sleeping pad will keep you. Some sleeping pads are insulated, some are not. If you're backpacking in the summer or in the desert and you don't need it, then you don't need as big of an R value. You still want that barrier between you and the ground, but it will be a lot lighter at a smaller R value because there's less fabric and less insulation. There are lots of options for sleeping pads. Some are inflatable where you use your mouth to blow them up. Some you have these bags that fill with air and you push the air into the sleeping pad and that's how it fills up. That's actually what I have because at high elevations it's really hard to sit down and spend 20 minutes filling up your sleeping pad with your lungs. There's self-inflating sleeping pads. They're the heaviest of the sleeping pads because they have a layer of foam that when you open the valve, the foam expands and sucks in the air. So that is a great option, but it's hard for backpacking to carry something so heavy and something that doesn't pack down as well. Then you have your foam sleeping pad where you notice that silver one, okay? This is going to be the best for any sort of wet environment, really lightweight backpacking. It's also the cheapest option that you have, and you don't have to worry about any sort of puncture wounds while you are backpacking. Um, like I said, my recommendation, I do a really lightweight one that doesn't have as much of an R value, and I use that bag to blow it up. But any winter hiking that I do or winter backpacking I do, I use the silver foam option there, um, because it doesn't matter if it gets wet, and it has that barrier. So here is your sleep system lecture, and there will be a couple questions from this lecture on the quiz. Like I said, please don't hesitate to ask me if you have any questions. I'm happy to get on a Zoom call with people and nerd out over some of the details of gear if you're interested.